Afternoon, everyone. My name is Jonathan Mickey. I'm president of Kellogg College, so it's a huge pleasure to be able to welcome you all to what's always a very important date in the college's annual calendar, the annual Vincent Strudwick Lecture. We're very grateful to the Graduate Theological Foundation for sponsoring this annual series of lectures to make it all possible. And now I'd like to introduce Professor Jane Shaw, who's going to preside over the lecture. Jane.
Well, it's great to be here for the 11th Vincent Strudwick Lecture, and as I look out into the audience, quite a few of you have been at all 11, which is fantastic. It's a great pleasure to introduce our 2022 Vincent Strudwick Lecturer, His Excellency Archbishop Claudio Gugerotti, Apostolic Nuncio, Ambassador in British speak of the Holy See to Britain. It's a huge honour that we have you here this evening, and I want especially to thank Sister Murray Henry Keane, who helped us get to the Nuncio, and also his chaplain, Father Joshua, who made the arrangement so fantastically easy. And of course, Vincent Strudwick himself, in whose honour this lecture is, and who at various key moments just made sure things were going okay. Let me introduce Archbishop Gugerotti. He was born in Verona. He said to me just now, Romeo and Juliet, or the two gentlemen of, whichever you prefer. And he was also ordained a priest in the Diocese of Verona, and in fact taught there for a little while. He holds not one, but two doctorates, one in Eastern Languages and Literature, the other in Eastern Ecclesiastical Studies, as well as a master's degree in liturgy, and specializes in the Armenian language. He has lectured in Patristics and Oriental Studies at the Pontifical Oriental Institute in Rome, the University of La Sapienza in Rome, and the state universities in Padua and Venice, and is well published in these areas, publishing several books. Archbishop Gugerotti entered the service of the Vatican in 1985, working at the Congregation for the Eastern Churches, and was appointed as that congregation's Undersecretary in 1997. In 2001, so 21 years ago now, he began his diplomatic career as well, his diplomatic service to the Holy See, when Pope St. John Paul II nominated him as Apostolic Nuncio to Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. He was consecrated as titular Archbishop of Ravello on the 6th of January 2002 in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. He became Nuncio to Belarus in 2011, to Ukraine in 2015, and happily to Great Britain in July 2020. And if you are followers of papal history, you will know that 3 different popes have appointed him to these diplomatic roles. So he's clearly deeply trusted and very good at it. Your Excellency, we are so honoured that you can be with us today. You are our very first ambassador to speak in this distinguished lecture series on religion and public life, and I think it's very appropriate. And I would like to say this was very much Vincent's choice. He very much wanted you to come and speak, and so thank you for agreeing to do that. And you're speaking on what is a very timely topic in the Europe of our days, which is religion and diplomacy in Europe today. Your Excellency.
Thank you. Thank you, dear. So, dear friends, the first thing is that I apologize for destroying your English language. But this is, what comes from my being Italian. So, if you see that something doesn't suit, just forgive me for that. First of all, let me express my deep gratitude for your kind invitation, especially to Canon Vincent Strudwick. after whom this lecture is named. I would also like to thank Professor Jane Cho, the Pro-Vice Chancellor, for her assistance in organizing this evening's event. Canon Strudwick has also asked that I make specific mention of Sister Marie-Henri, the Dominican, and thank her for her assistance and support. I thank all who work, live and study here at Kellogg College for your very kind welcome. I told already the gentleman who is working there that whenever I see that he falls asleep, it means that it is time to stop. So, I reflected a lot before writing these lines that I am sharing with you today. The subject is enormous, so I just choose something, you know. You will see, it's not even maybe very consequential, but it is what came. In my life, in my studies, I try to deepen the relationship that exists between the East and West, and what are the models of thought, even religious, but not only, I would say more anthropological, which characterize the mutual diversity between the two. I remember the years of my university studies, beautiful years. We went to lesson 3 times a year, because all the rest of the time at the university was occupied by revolutionary groups of various kinds. So, in this time of my university studies, in particular those oriented, as then my teaching was, on approaching the identity of peoples, starting from literary texts and liturgy, that is the common prayer that every culture has been able to process. Then, for 20 years, I was sent to live in the very places I had developed my reflections about. And this new experience helped me to recognize that from pure study of texts, mainly ancient ones, I had assimilated interesting global ideas, but with many abstracted, theoretical, stereotyped perceptions. And how much the life we read in the books changes over time, and how we adapt to practical situations. The title of my intervention tonight speaks of religion and diplomacy in today's Europe. I must therefore look at the contemporary situation, and I have to do it starting from my identity as a man of religion and a diplomat. I will always keep in the background, you will perceive it, the war in Ukraine, where I was as head of the Holy See's diplomatic mission for 4.5 years, up to 1.5 years ago, when I was moved to Great Britain, another world. I must confess that it is very difficult for me to look at almost all that the media published on the current conflict in Ukraine. I don't want to appear a snob, but the information that is given in all contexts seems very disappointing. It is as if everything were filtered by a pre-oriented aiming at passing a very dualistic, Manichaean vision, where everything is black and white. And I feel that this is terribly simplistic and does not match what I have seen and lived. The human being is the basis of every most complex aggregate reality. When creating an interpretation from above, people are often forced to adapt to a scheme that was prepared for them. There are few exceptions who can make use of critical instruments which are needed to have the freedom to choose, to evaluate positions, to highlight perceptions, to put together different points of view, and to weigh the validity and consistency of them. I'm very pleased and honoured to be here today at Kellogg College in Oxford, in one of the most prestigious universities in the world. Because the university can be exactly the place where one learns to acquire critical instruments that allow one to be freer in assessing reality and the interpretations we are exposed to. It's not always like that. Sometimes universities, rather than using the inductive method to look at reality and only subsequently extrapolate a theory, may tend to develop a preconceived theory and make it more convincing. But in this case, the university is no longer universitas, universal, that is, according to the whole, but becomes part of political, cultural, and especially economic power, which pays to create refined propaganda agents. This is not the case, of course. It is difficult to describe religion in Europe today. I'm quite convinced that religion is undergoing a moment of great transition. Maybe for the first time, the traditional religions seem to be, in the European West, increasingly irrelevant. The time of religious persecutions, of controversies, is over. Yet, traditional religions seem to disappear from the majority of people's horizon. Religion over the centuries was a dominant presence, not only in the way of thinking, but also in the symbolic expression of one's identity, for example, in the arts. It seems that the need to know where the subject of a poem or of a painting or a sculpture comes from is now somewhat irrelevant. Rather, more fascinating to people today is the individual way of perceiving one's emotion in front of it. In this way, knowing what religion was and becomes is easily ignored. I remember when I was in Dresden, in Eastern Germany, during the communist period. I went to visit the art museum. We're a small group of Catholic priests, probably selected because they thought that they could convince us more easily. And the director of that museum, in front of a huge painting of the Ascension of Mary, said, "Well, this is a lady and she is doing something, but he cannot tell you exactly who she is and what she is doing." So I realized I couldn't imagine that we would repeat the same model in short. The fact is that for the generation of our grandparents, religion was a prism through which much of life was interpreted. Even those who apparently contested religion had within them the inclination towards some form, even vague, of religiosity and spirituality. It is clear that we must distinguish on one side between religion in itself, starting from the numinosum and tremendum of Rudolf Otto, or the great existential questions about the sense of life, and on the other side, feeling an active part in a single tradition or religion. If active membership of traditional religions is seemingly decreasing, I continue to perceive profoundly religious questions in many people I encounter today. The attitude has deeply changed. In a marketplace, as our culture is today, many people prefer to approach life with a DIY attitude, a do-it-yourself attitude, or a do-it-my-way attitude, rather than looking for what is on offer in consolidated religious institutions. But there is another part of Europe we know very little about, the Central Eastern one. In that area, traditional religion was forcibly replaced by a different religion in terms of societal changes with its dogmas, rites, saints or heroes, and so on. The Marxist system was interested in creating a more just and shared concrete world view. For it, traditional religion was a way for diverting attention from earthly paradise by promising a place of bliss to those who were oppressed and discriminated in the present world. Instead, for them it was necessary to make them rejoice here, now, without pushing change into an intangible future. I made a study on the posters anti-religious in the Marxist world. The book that collects all these posters is in English and was published in England recently, 2 years ago. Very interesting, very interesting. If you have the occasion of approaching such a book, I would advise it to you. That it shows the changing of the representation of religion according to the different Marxist periods, starting from the description of priests as fat, drinking, over-drinking, I would say, and very rich person, putting their face in the place of the face of the icon to get the money, to the rockets and the facts that scientists and these people moving in the cosmos could not see Christ or God or whatever over there. So there is quite a difference. And the main characteristic, the main character of these descriptions are grandmothers. I think that if they could have killed old grandmothers, they would have done it very willingly. Why? Because if now we have many young people going to church, it is not because of the parents, but because of the grandmas. They even tried to insist on inviting people to go to big cities in order to isolate the family from the grandmother who was supposed to remain in the village. But what happened? That when they arrived in the city, they had to work 8, 10, 12 hours every day. So who kept the children? They had to invite the grandmothers to the cities. And that was another problem. This is just a very interesting opportunity. Eliminating religious presence in that context was much more difficult, however, than achieving the same goal today in democratic, consumeristic systems. This is something interesting. Such an incredible propaganda against religion. Nowadays, it's not necessary. Well, of course we do a strong propaganda against religion. It's less intelligent. It's full of stereotypes. There it was more accurate, much more accurately studied. And they didn't succeed. There is a precise reason for that. In the East, religion was sociologically still part of the blood of the inhabitants. It was an essential part of their identity, not only as individuals, but also as nations. Something we have experienced in the past, also in Europe, in Western Europe. It was the religion that had given these peoples the alphabet, designed to transmit both spiritual and social content, since religion was considered also the instrument to create good citizens. It would be interesting to go and study some of the text of the Eastern Europe, beginning of Asia. It's difficult to put a limit, of the 5th century, describing the reason why the alphabet was invented. It was a theological description. And the theology was that from that moment, Paul, Jesus, Moses started to speak the language of that people. And in that way, they could understand the laws of the gospel, but above all of the ancient testaments, and reproduce them in the country in order to move from a situation of barbarians to the situation of civilized people. 5th century. So, good citizens were considered those who put the teachings of religion into practice. In the East, as well as in the West, in ancient times, religion was the source of the moral rule, a way of acting unquestionedly, because it was dictated directly from God. And we know that this system is not only in Europe. We have a similar system in Islam. With the change of the model, in the West especially through the Enlightenment, religion lost her role as a guide for life, as it entered a more private sphere, while the state had to be ruled according to a more and more shared rational model. This does not happen in the Eastern world, apart from the Marxist parenthesis. For this reason, it was much more difficult to replace the religious with a materialistic social system, recognized as scientific, and therefore contrary to the emotional aspirations of human nature, described as primitive and deprived of rationality. We cannot forget that Marxism was elaborated in a purely Western mental system. Communism, alongside the persecution of those who openly professed a religion, soon adopted a more sophisticated approach, without abandoning the violent strategy, that is to come to terms with religion to make it an ally in propaganda for the political regime. Religion spoke a much more understandable language to peoples outside the communist territories, and was still accepted by a wide part of the inhabitants of the Marxist countries too. It was therefore good, or that is better than good, useful, through an assimilation of the religious system, to use priests and bishops who were allowed, at last, to have contact with the rest of the world, to reassure that many good things had happened after the revolution, and that it was not true that human rights were not respected. Moreover, they could convey ideals such as peace, something appreciated by the West, particularly in that period, and compatible with the Marxist strategy in that moment in time. After the fall of communism, in many of their citizens, there re-emerged a desire to express a suppressed religious consciousness. But let us be careful. We have to understand what it means. This manifested itself as a libertarian revenge against the atheistic oppressor. And that's at the same time, and this is the important point, they considered the opportunity to go back to the so-called eternal ethos of that nation. Thus, the idea that the deep roots of the identity of individual peoples, within which the religious element was very important, had to re-emerge, both to restore true human values and to strengthen the same peoples, rediscovering the part that Marxism had tried to eradicate. I remember an episode that made me smile, exactly because I thought of what the reaction of a Westerner might have been. In the eastern part of Ukraine, maybe 4 years ago, but the same thing would be valid even for other peoples, 60% of the inhabitants declared themselves Orthodox. Among these 60%, 40% identified themselves as atheist. The president of Belarus, where I was also for 4 years, still openly defines himself as an Orthodox atheist. In that range of thought, traditional values are those which the same ethos has from a kind of mythical beginning, and that the Church preached. In reality, many of these contents precede conversion to Christianity. These are the so-called perpetual and undeniable values that they compare with the Western so-called relativism. Some of them, as I said, are myths, but contradicting them and openly overturning them is considered the suicidal conduct of Western society. A real Orthodox citizen, but this is not valid only for the Orthodox, cannot be a non-patriot. A patriot is one who intimately preserves the historical identity of one's people, of which religion is a dominant factor. If something seems to threaten that national identity, then the religious authority will have to call the nation back to those roots that make the common conscience strong. I didn't mention specific recent episodes, but all of you understand to what I refer. This is especially true in contexts where there has been great persecution of political subjugation. Anthropological resources were all committed to defend, if not life because it was not possible, at least the survival of their culture. It is like in a physical body when there is an infection. The body forces focus and must be reinforced from the outside to overcome the infection. It is clear that this approach to religion is not easily understandable in our secularized context. For many in our societies, religion is an individual phenomenon, such as the way of dressing. And we are more accustomed to an inter-ethnic coexistence, although not always appreciated by everyone. But not understanding this difference between us and them means to ignore the culture of those we meet and encounter and sometimes fight on our way. This knowledge is a step before judgment. It is simply understanding. Evaluation comes afterwards. Now, this is the first part. Let us move to the diplomacy of a religion, if we can say so, a system I am a part of. I am a man of religion and a diplomat. What a strange mixture. It may also seem dangerous. For some people, putting together religion and diplomacy may imply a diplomacy applied only to support a religious vision of life. This can mean a further hindrance to be super partes, impartial, if an impartial diplomacy exists. What does a diplomat of the Holy See do? The first answer normally given is, of course, he defends Catholics. And in fact, in the past, this was the main task of the so-called Pontifical Legatus, or Apocrisiarius, corresponding to what we now call Nuncio. First of all, he is the representative not, as we often think, of the Vatican or the Vatican City, but of the See of Rome, where lives the head of the Catholic Church, the Pope, who in turn is the voice of 1,300,000,000 Catholics in the world. You see the difference between the Vatican City and the Holy See. The diplomat of the Holy See is therefore in a particular position. The Holy See is recognized as an official voice in the international arena. When it happened, of course, it was much easier. Now I have doubts that it could happen. And this took place even before, strictly speaking, there was a Vatican state, or even when it did not exist any longer. Since ancient times, in fact, and by many, the papal diplomacy is considered as the first expression of diplomacy tout court in the world. As I said, one of the goals of the Apostolic Nuncio is to ensure the rights of Catholics. And it has been his goal for a long time. While this was once the dominant focus of their work, it has become broadened by another particular dimension in recent decades. The task of the ambassadors of individual states is to defend and promote the interest of their state, ranging from the rights of citizens, political alliances, to the economic development of that country, through links and international treaties. The pontifical representative, on the other hand, has no concrete interest for his own country, does not sell, and does not buy, apart from strictly personal items, and has no territorial disputes. It has slowly become a subject that must express, or is intended to express, and promote moral values, which the world recognizes more or less in the voice of the Pope. His neutrality allows him in some cases to participate in negotiations of pacification as an unbiased force, which has no interests to defend except those represented by the social doctrine of the Church. Justice, equality, respect, attention to preserve and defend creation, the dignity of each human being, refusal of war, support of the poorest, and so on. At the center of everything is the human person. Each person, regardless of their social status, is created and loved by God. Even those who do not share the religious vision that are the basis of these principles. These peoples, sometimes even not Catholic, sometimes more frequently not non-Catholics, sometimes refer to the Pope's representative to reach authorities, countries, or even individual groups they officially cannot contact directly because political reasons prevent it. It happens especially with nuncios, it happened to me, that have to work in an area where two nations fight against one another. Of course, this possible mediation must often be unknown and confidential, because this helps the opposite parts to dialogue in view of the resolution of the conflicts. Moreover, it may allow to recall shared moral values in order to widen the implementation of human rights in places that do not promote them enough. Of course, to be honest, the mediation of the Holy See cannot contradict the principles of Catholic moral doctrine. This happens especially in multilateral diplomacy. Sometimes they tell me, some friends of mine who work in the United Nations, is it possible that the representative of the Holy See always take the same position as Saudi Arabia and the Russian Federation? Well, certainly there are aspects where with completely different perspectives, but we do that. But I can assure you that in my personal experience, this has not been a hindrance. An example, I found myself in a more direct and less public work, the liberation of so-called political prisoners. No state recognizes in principle, the existence of political prisoners, because they are accused of contradicting the current legislation. In a way or another, they can eat an ice cream in a forbidden place. This, of course, does not mean that political prisoners do not exist, however. They are seldom referred as such. Another aspect where the nuncio is involved concerns humanitarian aid, which, thanks to his diplomatic status and to his negotiations with those responsible, can reach parts of the population considered to be the opponents or even the traitors of that government. It happened to me in Ukraine. we collected all over Europe 16 million euros that the Pope gave to help the refugees from Donbass. The refugees from Donbass partially recognized the Ukrainian government, partially didn't. Those who didn't were paradoxically recognized as Ukrainian citizens, but you could not be in touch with them according to the Ukrainian government because they were traitors. The Russians never accepted that they were involved in Donbass. So the only possibility was to use a way to show sometimes that you are a bishop, sometimes that you are a diplomat, in order to get admission to that area. This is a very practical example. Of course, not of course, sorry. There is an element in religious diplomacy which can also be exercised by other religions or confessions, despite not having the diplomatic status of the Holy See, which is of particular importance. That of respect for all the interlocutors, in principle, even when they do not share or openly contradict the doctrine of the Church. The value given to the dignity of each person allows the pontifical diplomat, but also the representative of the Archbishop of Canterbury, as I saw in Armenia when I was there, allows to speak strongly against an idea or an action, but not to vilify or offend the interlocutor. This has created difficult situations in the past, as in the case of Nazism, where the Church was scolded for not publicly condemning those who were responsible for inadmissible crimes. On the contrary, in the case of communism, the Church was accused of having agreed to speak with the communist authorities, the so-called Ostpolitik, to induce them to greater tolerance towards Catholics, believers, and freedom in general. Let me conclude my lecture this evening with one personal impression. I take the responsibility of it only on myself. The political shouting, the vulgar offense of the opponent, the condemnation of an entire people, often fueled by the internet and the social media, is not a sign of greater freedom or authority. It is a decadence of political costume with an essentially populistic purpose to increase one's own support within one's own country. It goes together with an attitude that we Westerners have often practiced and partially continue to practice, to show us like the masters of the world, those who understood everything and must teach the barbarians how to behave. The more the average culture of politicians and diplomats has decreased, the less they are able to understand different cultures and to choose the right language to appeal to common values, without excluding the disagreements, of course. When President Prodi, at that time he was the president of the European Commission, asked me to accompany him to visit Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, he brought along with him all his entourage, mainly from Scandinavian countries. On the plane, he asked me, "What is your impression in our way of discussing with these governments?" And my answer, I didn't think about that, was, I will give you an example. You fall in love with a girl, and you want to be loved by her, to be accepted, and even more. Will you start by saying, what terrible hair you have? Oh, those glasses are awful. Oh, this lipstick it was used 20 years ago. This is what we do when we have these meetings. The World Bank, when I was in Ukraine, said openly to the government, we shall give you money, but your government has to approve this law, and this law. Otherwise, we shall not pay. Correct or non-correct, valid or non-valid, the requests. This is not a style. This is not diplomacy. This is imperialism. This is colonialism. This is not mainly a religious issue. It is an experimented and effective way to deal with cultures. Today, war is primarily fought with interviews and statements. Arms come later. Well, believe me, my experience of 20 years leads me to realize that aggressive language is the worst way to start any dialogue. Respect is a universal virtue which saves human life and does not bring relations among cultures and countries to primordial reactions. This would be the defeat of diplomacy. I, as a pontifical representative, of course, in my work, will never shout my contempt against any interlocutor, even if I would like to do it very strongly. Also because I am supposed not to feel it. A very, how can I say, optimistic approach. But I assure you that by conviction and by experience, I would not even do so if I were a lay ambassador or a lay politician. And out of pure professionalism. My conclusion, dear friends, is that even in contemporary Europe, whatever your personal religious position is, diplomacy can never ignore religion. If it does, the risk is to miss an important key that sometimes, even not explicitly, allows one to understand the very core of events without flying on the surface. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you so much. That was extremely rich and full of wonderful ideas and much wisdom too. We have plenty of time for questions now. Because we're live streaming, we just ask that you speak into the microphone, which I think Sarah is taking around. So, anyone want to ask the first question? Because if not, I will. Let me ask the first question while you're all thinking of yours, and I'll come and sit in the chair, which will make life easier.
Oh, yes, indeed.
You ended on a strong note that diplomacy can never ignore religion, but you reminded us earlier in the lecture that, of course, most people are rather ignorant about religion. Mm-hmm. So I guess it's a two-part question. One, do you find yourself informing other ambassadors? That's a personal question. Do you find yourself educating the other ambassadors? But more widely, what can we do about that ignorance?
Shall I answer immediately?
Yes, please do,
After
yes.
Okay.
They're all thinking of their excellent questions.
Yes. this is exactly what happens to me. In very many cases, the most strange countries send their ambassador to the nunciature for an explanation of what was behind they can catch at a first glimpse. This happens very frequently. And I must say that those who are more ignorant in general are exactly the Western diplomats of the world. Because of their, in some of them, it is a condition sine qua non for considering themselves objective to reject any kind of religious approach. But they live in countries where the real head of the state is the Orthodox Patriarch.
Yeah.
When I was the Dean of the Diplomatic Corps in Georgia, I brought the ambassadors who wanted to come to meet with the Catholicos Patriarch of the Orthodox Church. And they were totally astonished because they had the impression that for the first time they had an interpretation of the life of the country which is completely different from what the politicians raised in the United States gave. And the Patriarch, I remember, put the Russian Federation ambassador and the American United States ambassador, one at his right hand and the other at his left hand, because he was intelligent. So yes, what we can do is what you are doing. Teach. Teach. Put a book in the hands of these people, so that they can understand that this thing which is called the gospel is not a series of enchantments or spells or whatever they imagine it is, but it has something inside which is still lived by Christians who nowadays die for the sake of these ideas or for the sake of this person or whatever you want to do. I remember a German ambassador, for example, she, at the beginning of every party, she came to me and then she shouted, "As you know, I am an atheist." And I told her, because we call by name generally, I said, "Sylvia, and as you see, because of the cassock, I am not." So, can we start eating now? You see, if at the beginning you don't reject the attitude that sometimes is not pleasant of these people, you can slowly show that you don't reject them because they are atheists, but they cannot pretend that I cannot speak because I am religious. And this is already a good achievement, because the next time she will come to know what's going to happen in the country. And when, in front of all the people demonstrating against the gay pride, 8,000 people, there were 40 Orthodox priests, while people marching were 15. And all these people rushed towards the bus and burnt the bus where these people were supposed to get on. And so they came and said, "Why? Why?" I can explain. And I tried to explain, not particularly the religious reason that is shameful very, very often, but the sociological reason which is covered by the religion vestment. And then they get interested, because many of the organizers of these gay prides were the Western ambassadors. And they didn't understand that in that situation, each person marching needed 4 policemen to be defended by the people, from the people, from the people. They were furious. And even young gays, they went home and they were desperate. Because when they saw, various phenomena that, take place here in having the way of dressing, they said, I'm not like that. I'm not like, it means that there is no space for me. And the number of suicides increases. So I told an ambassador, open a room of your embassy, put a person that listens to them, because they have nobody who listen, who are ready to listen to them. And this is the reason why they suffer so much. So you cannot start from a pride for something that didn't happen. There was no victory. There is only defeat. So what did we want them to be proud of? Well, the answer is sometimes I've never thought about that. I thought I could do the same thing as in my country. This is an example. Too long, sorry.
No, it's a wonderful example, and it points to the ways in which you are a translator in a very profound way, actually. And you're not just doing it from the Holy See to the country you're in, but you're doing it between other ambassadors about the country you're in. So you have an enormously important role.
I have when the ambassadors are interested.
Okay.
There are countries where they aren't.
Yes.
Well, they don't come to see me if they want to understand Great Britain.
So...
Because they think they know everything, of course, so the religious aspect is irrelevant to them.
Well, I was thinking about a story. When you said, I'm going to make sure I quote you properly, you talked about in Belarus, the Orthodox atheist.
Yes.
I did wonder if there was a parallel. It's very different, but I just wondered if there was a parallel or analogy with the idea that everyone in Britain is a member of the C of E unless they're not. That's dying out a bit now, but there's a book which some of you may know by the anthropologist Kate Fox called Watching the English. And in it, she tells a story about a mother and daughter in a doctor's surgery. Back in the day when you had to put your religion on the form, I don't think we have to do that anymore. And so the daughter's about 16, says to the mum, what religion do I put? She said, we're not any religion, are we, mum? So the mum says, oh, just put C of E. Oh, she said, but we're not a religion, mum. She said, no, it's just what you put. So there is a little element of that, which I think is not so true now. Now, I have lots of questions, and we could go on talking, but I know there's someone back there with a question. So please wait for the microphone for the live streamers.
All right. Thank you very much for the talk. It was very impressive and very related to my area of work. You framed...
Please tell us who you are.
My name is Tiago. I'm the Director of Religious Studies for CONTED. And I really like the way you framed Marxism and liberalism as a reaction to old religious patterns, a reaction which caused more repression, persecution of religious believers, or in the case of liberalism, just push religion to the private sphere. At the same time, as you explained very well, in Eastern Europe, as well as in the Americas, in Latin America, where I come from, there is a revival of religion. And in this revival, we continue to see marginalization of members of minority groups. So Patriarch Kirill is openly supporting the war in Ukraine. We have the rise of Bolsonaro and Trump, decisions of the Supreme Court that have a religious background. So in the US, so religion is not bringing anything new to the table. And I would like to know from you if religion can bring any color to the black and white divide that you mentioned in the beginning.
That is a very interesting question. What makes us suffer sometimes as religions is the fact that we're many colors inside. So many colors that sometimes we cannot speak to each other. That is a phenomenon that enters the Catholic Church apparently monolithic since the very beginning of eternity. This is terrible, but it helps to understand that we have not to take anything for granted, and that whenever we say that it has always been like that, we say it because we are ignorant. I'm sorry to say that is good as a principle also for the most static religions. In fact, they have always moved. The fact that they recognize it or not is another problem. But they have always been. I saw somebody sent a joke to me a few days ago, where I think all of you have seen it. There was a man in the car, and he was a Muslim. It's not politically correct. It's not politically correct. I apologize in advance. And this person says, "Please, I mean, your radio shouts in such a way that I cannot stand, because at the time of the Prophet, there was no radio." So, the taxi driver just slows down the radio, then opens the car and says, "There was no taxi at the time of your founder, so wait for a camel." You see, when we fix on stereotypes, it is not that we are more believers. It means that we are more ignorant. And it is a must of religions to rediscover the historical aspects of the development of their own institutions. Otherwise, we create fundamentalists. Be it in the East, in the United States, or wherever. And this is not a problem of the fact that religion implies necessarily that principle. The problem is that we have never thought of an alternative. So, I don't know, it was much more articulated because, of course, there is a big difference in the attitude of the support of religion by fundamentalists in the United States and in the Eastern countries or in the Middle East. But basically you have caught exactly the core of the problem. That is the idea that time means degeneration of the original purity of religion, which in the case of Christianity is absolutely the denial of incarnation, where God takes flesh, and from that time, flesh belongs to God. But of course, according to classical metaphysics, we were used to imagine that the most beautiful things we can say of God is that he is motionless. Unfortunately, it does not correspond to the Jewish Christian revelation. In our revelation, God has never been motionless from the very beginning when he created the world. So, how to put together classical philosophy with our thoughts? Because the vast majority of people still think in terms of a philosophical approach to God, not of the revelation of God. Revelation is totally irrelevant. God is the old man that punishes the evildoers. And this is certainly not a kind of Judeo-Christian approach. So we should discuss a lot in details, but that is you got a very important point, according to me.
I think we have time for one last question, and that goes to Canon Vincent Strudwick, but he needs to wait for the microphone.
Well,
No, you do.
it's just a comment.
Well, can you please wait for the microphone? Great.
Thank you. It's just a comment on what you said. The founder of the community, and it's really about fundamentalism, which was part of your answer. He used to say, you know, you're never wholly wrong except when you think you're wholly right. And it's just that fundamentalism which I think impedes so much of the kind of work that you are now able and have set before us this evening. So, down with fundamentalism.
Amen.
So I think we've come to the moment in the evening where we get to have a drink, actually. But first I want to thank you, Your Excellency, for a subtle, brilliant lecture, actually, in which you presented so much wisdom to us, as I said before, both in terms of the countries you experienced, having studied them, and how central it is to understand religion in those countries, but also you opened our eyes to what it means to be a nuncio, and how that is different, perhaps, from some other ambassadors and what they do. And clearly you personally are playing an enormously important role in helping to educate those other ambassadors, and also you're showing compassion in all kinds of ways that is just actually rather touching. So I think we've all been very moved and as well as educated by your wonderful lecture, and thank you for your time and thank you for being with us. Thank you for giving the 11th Vincent Strudwick Lecture. Brilliant.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.